you should get a message in a second saying we're recording. Okay, thanks very much for being here today, folks. We're going to record this session, so I assume that you're consenting to the session being recorded. We've got quite a few people on the call itself, including Wayne Ross's students. So thanks to those guys who are here too. So what we'll do is we'll quickly move on from me onto Dennis Beach, who is a pleasure to have Dennis Beach doing this, because Dennis Beach was actually my external examiner for my PhD. And yeah, he was very good. He gave me a good grilling, but it was necessary, I think. So that's great for me to have him here. I will encourage you to type in questions and comments into the box, and we can collate them to discuss at the end. So we're not going to have questions as we move through the presentations, but we'll have them right at the end. And I will also do a bit of a talk about the way that I designed the volume and how I came to design in that particular way. Just a short kind of bit from me at the end before moving into a plenary and having a discussion. We've had some really good discussions, actually, some really interesting points of tension, particularly between different strands of Marxism. And I hope, we can continue some of those discussions. So that just leaves me to say thank you ever so much. And I should say my name's ALPESH MAISURIA. I'm the volume editor. And I'm going to pass over to Dennis now to explain the proceedings.
You haven't left me much to do, matey. You've done my job for me already, more or less. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me to join the group in writing a chapter, and also inviting me to ruin your evening by being a time bandit and chairman at this session. We're all very disciplined, so I don't need to remind everyone of the 5-minute time cap that we've imposed on these sessions. At the moment, the running order that we had originally has been changed. We start with Brad, followed by me, Sarah. Sebastian Engelman is not joining us. Derek Ford has not joined us yet, as far as I can see. Mariya and Robert. Mariya's joined us, but Robert hasn't. He's teaching, so we're moving them to the end of the presentation sessions before ALPESH comes back to us. And then we have Peter and Peter. And then Ravi was down to speak, but he's not joining us, followed by Bernard and Wayne. So that's the modified running order, 5 minutes apiece. And the first person on the list was Brad, the series editor. So I'm going to hand straight over to you, Brad.
I want to say, hey, thanks so much for inviting me here today. I really appreciate it. And I'm certainly familiar with most of the people's work, obviously, in this particular volume, as well as the series. I'll talk about the series. And not only that, but for years upon years doing my PhD work, and ever since moving on through academia in terms of connecting with your work at AERA, the American Educational Research Association conferences, the Journal of Critical Education, Journal of Critical Education Policy Studies. Also been connected with many of your work with the Routledge series. So I know of your work. It's a very honor to be here today. So I appreciate all of that. And I'm just going to briefly introduce the series, and I just provide a minute overview of this particular volume. So if people are interested, this series is with Brill, and it's called Critical Studies in Understanding and Education. The field of education in the 21st century is broad in scope and multidisciplinary. To help scholars and students understand the various disciplines that comprise the field of education, we're looking at editors who view the various fields such as text to be historicized and explicated. So we're looking at each field as a discipline with its own scholars, language, and research. So we're looking for people, if you're interested, any of your colleagues want to continue to contribute to this particular series that I've connected with Brill and my colleague Bill Reynolds from Georgia Southern University to contribute. So if you have some particular projects, students, colleagues who are in the critical vein who would like to be part of it, this is one particular volume. There's also a volume that came out recently on critical whiteness studies, queer studies in education, radical philosophies, I know I've talked to PETAR about something about critical understandings of technology. So if you're interested, please let me know. It's growing. It's a growing volume. It's a growing series. So this is what it is. But in particular, this volume, we're looking at the Encyclopedia of Marxism in Education. It's first of its kind. It's a landmark text with relevance for years to come for the productive dialogue between Marxism and education for transformational thinking and practices. And I think ALPESH and everyone in this particular text have designed the book to appeal to many readers within Marxism and education who are involved in the intellectual tradition, and also those who are curious newcomers as well as critics of Marxism. So this is one landmark text out of a series of 5 encyclopedias that have come out over the past 3 years. I really appreciate all of the contributions and fine work, and I'm glad that ALPESH has decided to continue to move forward with these conversations through Zoom, getting people across the globe to connect. I hope that some people will be at AERA coming, if you're able to, in San Diego or other academic conferences to connect. Please let us know. Again, I can send you a link, and ALPESH can as well if you're interested in critical understandings of education, if you want to contribute an encyclopedia, and we'll move forward with other projects. So thanks so much for hosting me today. Thanks so much for all these excellent entries that you put together for this encyclopedia. And just, it's really great to see colleagues online. I know I haven't seen many of you in person, or I haven't met you in person, but at least to be connected through Zoom is a treat for me today. So have a great conversation and a dialogue, and that's about it. How does that sound, ALPESH?
Fabulous.
All right, thanks so much.
Absolutely brilliant, and thanks. Very, very good, fast, dynamic presentation that stayed within time. Perfect. I suppose that's over to me now to ruin everything by being slow and drab and going over time, but I'll try not to. The chapter I wrote is on Marxism and ethnography of education. Its point of departure is in Marxism as a revolutionary movement supported by a set of accepted ideas emanating from the Second International and generated through the radical analyses of the capitalist political economies in the scientific work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It recognizes that these ideas neither accepted, distorted, nor distorted the material developments and their history, but instead engaged with them by interrogating the past and searching within it for a genealogy of present conditions in order to reveal a means for their transcendence in a smile of revolt. This searching for the genealogy of the present in order to reveal and engage in a means of social transformation is also a role that's described for Marxist critical ethnography of education in the chapter. Such a movement is accomplished by establishing analysis of transient contingent realities in dialogue with the continuities and discontinuities, identifications and ruptures that make the past. But it does so as a means in order to engage with and empower process of positive change in the present as political projects and practices. In this sense, the Marxist critical ethnography of education incorporates 2 central concerns of critical theory. And these are namely an empirical analysis of and through involvement in the contradictions and conflicts of capitalist societies and their institutional practices, and B, a reflexive clarification of the epistemological and normative grounds for such an explanatory critique. ALPESH mentioned that I examined his thesis in 2016, just before Christmas. I'm still waiting for my beer. And this thesis and a co-authored article in Oxford Research Encyclopaedia from 2018 actually explores this notion, as does the present chapter. It's about how critical theory can be pursued practically and pragmatically through ethnography in relation to and as part of, i.e. as inseparable from, explanatory criticisms of the historical development of the forces of production of state leadership and the supporting formation of social consciousness in education to generate an ethnography that can better meet the demands of radical engagement against education systems that produce both semantic security for their subjects and symbolic violence, i.e. alienation, at one and the same time. This form of ethnography analyzes, therefore, precisely the historical formation of stable institutions as systems of action within normative conditions of social reproduction, and as discussed in educational research since at least the publication of Basil Bernstein's Class Codes and Control, Volume 3 in 1975, and from then onwards, working towards a theory of educational transmissions and transformation. The final part of the chapter actually tries to present an illustration of this element of Marxist ethnographic work in practice. It relates to a way of uncovering and challenging the forms of coercion in educational institutions, when the dominated give in to the dominator and therefore to domination, because their understanding of their situation incorporates instruments of the dominant class hegemony, rather than conceptions of revolutionary action of a kind that can give human nature a new and greater or broader expression. The dominant class hegemony is therefore basically the means by which the dominant class is able to gain the power and authority needed to control society and oppress the oppressed through ideological indoctrination in educational institutions that comprise tight norm systems, but that also apply additional norms to fix their validity and means of realization. Yet they also exist alongside schools that are structured by less tightly framed systems and that contain continual discussions and challenges about and toward the validity of their practices and processes of processing the subject. The Marxist ethnography of education described in the chapter views educational institutions in this way, as at one and the same time sites of practice and objects of conflict and critique that can precipitate shifts in registers of justification. Such an ethnography illustrates how underdetermined, contradictory and uneven social phenomena and material outcomes are interwoven within the politics of education, within the economic, cultural and confusing aesthetics of national and global education systems. In this sense, it is in this sense that an ethnography is an example of Marxist critical ethnography, according to the chapter. And I didn't go over time.
Thanks, Dennis. And I think just to, before I hand back reins to you, you might have forgotten that I got you rather a lot of wine. Sorry, beers actually, chocolate beers in Sweden.
I do indeed, my
back
friend.
in February.
I do, in fact. And also a rather uncomfortable tray of beverages on one occasion in Breslau. So.
That's right. So back to you, Dennis.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm finished. I was just about to relax, go get myself my usual evening cup of Horlicks after such an endeavour. But after me, it was Sarah. I'm going to be relatively relaxed now from now on, Sarah. So I'm not going to shout about 4 minutes. I'll just give you until 5 minutes, and then I'll say that's 5 minutes. And you can try to wind down. We've lost a couple of presenters, so we don't need to be as stringent, perhaps, as usual. Sarah, thanks. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Dennis. Thank you to everyone as well for joining us, and to everyone for presenting their work, and especially to ALPESH for all of his efforts to pull this volume together and these events as well. By way of starting my comments, I want to begin by recognizing that I'm joining you today from Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is located on the traditional territories of the Council of Three Fires, which is an Anishinaabe alliance of the Ojibwe, Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. I know that as a group, we're very spread out around the world, but we're all located within a set of material and social relations that constitute our ability to reproduce our daily lives. And acknowledging those relations and that history of where I'm located begs the questions that Shahrzad and I have been posing in this chapter, which are how best to account for the proliferation of differentiated capitalist social relations, how to understand the roles of education and knowledge in that proliferation, and how to imagine the way forward. So the chapter that Shahrzad and I have contributed to this volume is divided into 3 parts with 3 aims. The first is a section called Our Roots, and our goal there is really to situate readers within the complex threads of feminist, queer, anti-racist, anti-colonialist, and anti-imperialist literature that influences the emergence, development, and trajectory of Marxist feminist work. And the reasons for that wide-ranging influence, I think, really emerge from the diverse social struggles that have required activists and organizers to draw from Marx to understand the role of capital in the forms of oppression and exploitation that we live within. And what ties that work together is a commitment by both theorists and activists to deepen our understanding of the particularities of forms of social difference and oppression within the global relations of capitalism and its dynamics of accumulation. So in the first section, we're really looking at who are the main contributors to the Marxist feminist tradition. In the second section, which is titled, I think, Our Ground, our purpose is really to articulate how we understand a Marxist feminist approach in education, which foregrounds, I would say, historical materialist dialectics as an approach to inquiry, rather than thinking of Marxism as a closed theory of society, very much following what Dennis was just talking about. And focusing on dialectical inquiry, I think, allows us to recognize the limitations of what has come before, but also to move forward in our understanding of the ways in which capitalism as a mode of life is concretized in particular social relations and formations, particularly racialized and gendered ones. We see education as a field that has an important contribution to make here, given our close study of epistemological relations, including forms of consciousness, ideology, and praxis. And we believe that a formulation of these concepts that is expansively dialectical, historical materialist, anti-racist, and feminist can hopefully allow educational researchers to both confront the workings of ideology and also enact revolutionized pedagogical relationships that allow learners to really collectively sort of get to work, if you will, on the project of human emancipation. The third section of our chapter is titled Our Growth, and it focuses on two growing aspects of feminist theory that are relevant to those interested in a Marxist feminist approach to education. The first of those is the debates concerning intersectionality, which are vast, and recognizing that intersectionality is not a single or unitary theory. There are debates to be had about some of the ontological questions associated with that tradition. And we believe that it is here that, what Dorothy Smith calls the ontological shifts of historical materialism can be useful in addressing that challenge. And the problem that intersectional scholars set out to address is one that we share and we have sympathy with, and which we see mirrored in Marxist feminist struggles, as Hamani Banerjee says, to develop a concrete representation of a concrete existential situation of simultaneity. That's a mouthful. Recognizing that simultaneity and intersectionality are different conceptual forms that have different political aims. The second area of growth that we detail in the chapter is the renewing interest in socialist feminist articulations of social reproduction. And this is another area in which there's extensive debate, but there's a general agreement within that field that we're talking about an approach that is interested in the reproduction of labor and labor power, and not societal reproduction writ large. But in that way, I think social reproduction theories are important to the field of education and can help to expand our analysis of capitalism within a feminist reading of labor and labor power, particularly as the labor of educators contributes to those reproductive dimensions within capitalism. We end our chapter with a bit of a challenge, I think, to the broader field. We think it's quite crucial for Marxist scholars to recognize the particular role of feminist and anti-racist theory, and particularly of women of color, on an international scale in the development of this body of knowledge, and to understand that their work more fully illuminates the dialectical relations of difference and class, and thus generates, I would argue, a more expansive and fulsome understanding of capitalism. The marginalization and erasure of that work as somehow outside of or peripheral to the central contradiction of class, we think is a conceptual weakness at the center of most Marxian scholarship. And so we argue that it's only through explicitly anti-racist and feminist work that the full meaning of class contradictions can really be understood. Am I within 5 minutes?
Well, I think you've probably got a little bit more because you've got Shahzad here as well. So
Shahrzad been doing a lot of presentations, and so we decided that I would be the only one to present today.
Right, okay, that's fine.
I was muted. Before I was muted before I was interrupted by the boss over there on my left. Thank you very much, sir. That's absolutely magnificent. You went very slightly over 5 minutes, but just on the moment, on the cusp of me shouting, that's 5 minutes, you said you were just about to wind down, so I didn't say anything. Splendid, fantastic, very exciting content too. Don't be surprised if you get invitations to write many more exciting chapters and articles in relation to these things. After Sarah on the list, we did have Sebastian and then Derek, and Sebastian has pulled out, and Derek has not, as far as I can see, materialized yet. So we'll push him forward. We've already moved Mariya and Robert to the end. So we've then got in order Peter Hudis and then Peter Jandric. So really, I suppose if we take Peter Hudis first, if I pronounced that name correctly, I'm very pleased. I most probably didn't, so I apologize.
No, that's quite all right. You came quite close, Udis, but you know, nobody gets it right the first time.
Okay, thanks very much. Over to you, matey.
Thank you all very much. I come to you from Chicago, which is occupied Guatemala, Miami, and Winnebago territory. And my contribution to the inside, I first want to say, of course, that this is great work that ALPESH and others put together to make this volume possible. And you've given us a model of self-organization. My contribution could have been entitled, "The Educators Must Themselves Be Educated," I guess. And the reason I say that is that while there's been a huge amount of work done in recent years to criticize neoliberalism from various quarters, it doesn't seem to have resulted in a huge amount of progress when it comes to developing a vision of an alternative to capitalism. Now, of course, it's easy to say that the alternative to neoliberalism is replacing privatization, free markets, and private property with planned production and nationalized property. But I think history plainly shows that this is no alternative to capitalism at all. As the experience of both social democracy and Soviet-type societies showed, socialized markets and nationalized property are completely compatible with statist, racialized capitalism, so long as value production remains untouched. So what's the alternative to capitalism that transcends free market capitalism and state capitalism? It remains a largely untheorized issue, frankly, in contemporary Marxism. While we have seen a vital resurgence of interest in socialism in various parts of the world in recent years, socialism, such as it is, remains largely understood as still in terms of public versus private ownership, a fair redistribution of surplus value, etc. But since it's impossible to redistribute what does not exist, leaving matters there tends to treat production for the sake of augmenting wealth in monetary form as a transhistorical reality that cannot be overcome. And that staying there can hardly assist very much the effort to envision an alternative. It's for this reason that my essay, in line with much of my work over the past decade, tries to present the argument that Marx's critique of political economy goes much deeper than the phenomenal level of property forms and market relations, but rather takes aim at the alienated forms of human praxis that make them possible, beginning, but by no means ending, with those at the point of production. That is, Marx's critique of capital targets the underlying relations of production and reproduction that make property forms and exchange possible. And these relations, in turn, hinge upon a particular modality of time. And I think that's the crucial issue: socially necessary labor time. This disciplining force of socially necessary labor time, law of the world market, the law of value, compels concrete labor to become subsumed by abstract or alienated labor, which is, of course, according to Marx, the substance of value. Well, the logical conclusion seems that the alienation of the producers from the direct democratic control of their living conditions, including production and outside of it, has to be ended. Otherwise, the system is capitalist, regardless of what anyone calls it. A Marxism that's adequate for our time, as I see it, has to be defined by opposition to all social formations, whether at work, in the family, or in everyday life, in which human relations take on the form of relations between things. This humanist dimension of Marx's critique of value production, I argue, provides the conceptual ground for developing an intersectional Marxism that views struggles against racism and women's oppression and LGBTQ struggles as well as no less integral to challenging capitalist formations than the general or so-called general class struggle. Now, we've lived through a pretty important historical turning point over the last few years, which I think makes this perspective at least worth discussing. One expression is the tens of millions of workers around the world who left their jobs during the pandemic in recognition of how it made explicit how the finite and precarious nature of our time, that is the time in which we live, and which capital robs us of what is left of it. This great resignation, as it's called, has to be seen, I think, as one of the most important rejections of alienated or abstract labor in the history of capitalism. While it does not by itself provide an alternative to capitalism, it surely points us in the right direction. No less important is another expression, the remarkable anti-racist protest that swept much of the world during the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, which involved 26 million people totally in the US alone.
That would be 5, Peter.
An abolished prison that have become integral to the protests represented a tremendous development since they herald a very different kind of redistribution of wealth than found in social democratic and Marxist-Leninist approaches, since it was part and parcel of challenging the existence of the very status institutions that make capitalism possible. So to end, a revolutionary critical pedagogy has to proceed from the reason found in movements from practice. By having our eyes and ears open to new concepts and approaches found in them, we can make progress, I think, in developing a philosophically grounded alternative to capitalism, or at least we could do so and can do so if we as educators are willing to be educated.
Thank you very much, Peter. Exceptional, engaging, interesting. I'm enthralled actually by that presentation. From Peter to Peter. Peter Jandric.
Jandric, exactly. Thank you very much
for
your kind introduction. It's really, really amazing to be here. I would just like to say thanks so much, ALPESH, for making this whole event together, but also the book together, which is a huge deal. It seems that Brad is gone, but actually he's also surely supported this in a great way, and I think it's important to acknowledge all the people who did this work behind the scene, because editing such a huge volume is really not a small thing. It's really a huge achievement, and it's a huge thing to connect all those people coming from different parts of the world and actually working from different perspectives, because we are all kind of Marxists, but then we are also so different at the same time. And I think that this diversity is what makes us strong. It's what makes us really something. This event and the whole book, which makes it really important. And speaking of diversity, you may have noticed that my video has been disappearing and appearing on and off for a few times. And the reason for that is because I'm in Zagreb, Croatia. It's 9:30 p.m. at the moment. I have an 8-year-old son at home. It's just the two of us alone. And he's got some questions every few minutes that I need to respond to, and I need to put him to sleep eventually. So this whole event has kind of entered my home in an inconvenient time, but it was just necessary because of all these time zones and all this diversity and all these people from all around the world coming over. So I'm not pulling any grudges. But the thing is that this is not the first time, and this is not the last time that work has actually entered my private space in this way. And Wayne here just half an hour ago said that you're still working from home. And I can imagine that after 2 years of working from home in the COVID, that probably work and home situation becomes really totally entangled, and it's really difficult to divorce one from the other. And actually, we are having here Ruth Rukowski, right? Hello, Ruth. How are you? Nice to see you as well. It's not just that work comes into our homes. It's also we have digital technologies allow us to. I mean, obviously, Glenn connected through his wife's account and so on, and then we have people who, and then we have David here with all those beautiful bikes and the guitar, and I actually really want to ask a few questions about the guitar because it sounds like this Mexican bass big thing. I'm not sure whether I'm right or not, but anyway, so the thing is, I'm trying to say that technologies have brought huge transformations in our lives, and it's not just transformations in terms of labor and in terms of traditional categories that we use in Marxism, but it's also in our really deeply within our private lives and within our also biological existence. And I think that really we are witnessing some profound transformations of relationships between biology, information, and society in the widest sense. And these transformations that I've been blabbering about for a few minutes now are actually, well, there is this community that I'm part of that we are trying to call it post-digital. So the topic of my paper really was the post-digital transformations of Marxism. What happens to Marxism at these unique crossroads between biology, information, and society, which really unfold in front of our eyes? They unfold as we speak. They don't just unfold, or they didn't just unfold with the COVID-19 pandemic, which was probably the most obvious case. But now we also have the war in Ukraine, and we have all these energy questions, and we have all this talk about the Third World War, and we have all this talk about nuclear weapons again. I used to study physics, and I never really believed that somebody would pull the nuclear arms argument again at this age and at this stage of development of civilization. But people do these things. And then again, we have new generations and iterations of these relationships between biology, information, and society. What my paper suggests, or it just really very humbly does a few things. First, I argue that Marx is really, really important, relevant, and crucial for our situation. Yes, Marx lived in a very different world from ours, but his analysis transcends all those differences. But then I also, and this is a bit of a Freirean tradition that I'm using here, I also think that we should not blindly follow Marx, we should reinvent Marx for the moment here and now. And the third thing is that I just offered a few basic ideas and concepts of how this reinvention might take place and might unfold in the near future. And I think I'm just in time, so thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Peter. I was muted, so when I told you you'd just gone past time, you didn't hear me. And then I unmuted myself to say you were just going past time and you finished. So
that's very post-digital. That's very post-digital as well.
Really? I just thought I was being clumsy as usual. Thank you very much. Now then, Ravi can't join us, and that brings us on to you, Bernard, I think. You're still
yeah, sorry, I was I was not anticipating coming on just yet. Well, first of all, thank you to ALPESH for inviting me to contribute. I do think it's an extremely significant achievement of bringing together so many contributors and trying to develop some sort of focus. I think it is important that we continue these discussions, and I hope it's not being impertinent to say that I hope that this will go further and that this is kind of an initiation of a process rather than being seen as a culmination of things, or rather thinking that we have written the last word, as it were, on everything that we've had to say. And I'm sure that's how ALPESH envisions it, and it's certainly you know, my kind of perspective in terms of the whole initiative. The contribution that I made is based on in part on work that I did around the question of essentially British imperialism and Palestine, and looking at the history of Palestine, and the book that I wrote on the Balfour Declaration called the Balfour Declaration, Empire, Mandate and Resistance in Palestine. And I gave it that title because I wanted to indicate very clearly that this was not just kind of a one-sided perspective that I was trying to illustrate and develop, but also to show the interaction and the conflict that existed and the resistance that the Palestinians put up to the British and British imperialism. And in the course of that, I was looking at the nature of British imperialism and how it operated, how it functioned, and the way in which the, to use that expression, uneven and combined developments that were taking place at the time in the social, economic and political sphere had consequences in all sorts of ways, with all sorts of different contradictions and perspectives and so on. And that process, indeed, if you look at the current situation in respect of Palestine, there is at this point in time, you know, a continuing debate around education specifically, with the contributions from people like Narit Peled and Samira Alayan and Noor Masalha and others, writing about what has happened to education and what is happening to education for the Palestinians. So this chapter that I've written, or the contribution that I've made, is attempting to look at the way in which the social and economic deformations imposed as a result of imperialism clashed with, if you like, more indigenous processes of social, economic and political growth that were taking place. And these things were colliding in different ways, with different force, different emphases and different dynamics. But in that course of that, you know, obviously there was a perspective from the Palestinians of seeking to establish a national identity, a national self-determination and independence, which was met with repression by British imperialism and had consequences in respect of that. So the contribution draws on, if you like, what Marx had to say about the perspective of the way in which society is transformed under imperialism, and Lenin and Trotsky and so on, and to look at what happened within education, where there was an attempt to counter the enforced imposition by imperialism on the Palestinians of a structure, of a content, of a methodology, of a whole approach to education, which was clearly designed in order to deliver a perspective that conformed to imperialism's kind of desires and wishes. But that was countered by, in all sorts of other ways, in terms of challenging what was happening, with educationalists putting forward alternative perspectives, people like Sakakini, Tota, Khalidi, and others, who were presenting a different vision and perspective for what education was, in a liberating sense of engagement and assertion of Palestinian self-determination and independence. So the contribution is attempting to look at that process and what was happening specifically within the situation of the context of Palestine as a consequence of that clash between different social, economic and political forces, which were moving at different paces in different ways and with different kind of degrees of force. I think that's my 5 minutes. Which seems now unbelievably short, but
done it again. You're actually inside time, Bernard, if you want a minute or two more.
Just to say that, you know, as I said early on, this is part of an ongoing discussion. People in Britain will be very well aware that there is a great deal of animosity about the education in Palestine, attacking textbooks and the curricula and so on, which is being animated by pro-Israeli supporters, but is being responded to very, in my view, very courageously by people like Narit Peled, writing a critique not of the Palestinian education system, but the way in which the Israeli education system is creating and recreating an ideological justification and for the way in which the Israeli state is treating the Palestinians and what is happening. And I think that's a kind of legacy of this whole process of the way in which imperialism sought to create an education system with a clear ideological objective.
Many thanks. Wonderful. We're not doing too badly as far as time's concerned. Derek, I'm not locating Derek on the screen. Have you heard anything?
No. I think we can assume that Derek's not good.
Okay, and we know Ravi's not coming. That just leaves us with two more presentations. The suggested order would put you next, Wayne, and then leave Maria and Robert to the end because of the earlier teaching commitment that I now see that Robert has managed to escape from. But are you ready to go, Wayne?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dennis.
Yes.
I'm coming to you from Vancouver, British Columbia, on the occupied territory of the Musqueam people. I have a few students from my doctoral seminar. We're in our last seminar meeting of the term today. We'll start up after we finish here. The chapter that I wrote along with Sandra Matheson is on critical education. And I really appreciate, well, first of all, I really appreciate ALPESH's work on this massive project and Brad and Bill's support of it with their series at Brill. But I also appreciate ALPESH's open mind to have Sandra and I contribute on this particular topic, because really, what is critical education? And that was, even though we founded a journal 12 years ago that goes by that name, this put us in a situation where we were trying to define what the concept is itself, particularly in the North American context, where Marxist analysis of education is so highly marginalized. And what we do, and I'll just describe the structure of the chapter, across the in this definitional project, we set out to define critical education, identify its foundational sources, and then identify some various manifestations of it. In terms of trying to provide an answer to the question of what is critical education, we would say that it is broadly a field or approach that works theoretically and practically towards social change that anticipates a post-capitalist world. Certainly, it challenges the existing state of affairs in society and in schools, higher education, and informal education, confronting capitalism, racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, etc. And part of the main aim for us with this chapter was to examine the conflation of the notion of critical pedagogy and what critical education is. And in short, what we argue is that in disentangling these perspectives, critical education functions, critical pedagogy functions as one of the manifestations of critical education. In terms of distinctions, distinctive features of critical education, first of all, an important distinction between schooling and education, focus on structural and institutional relationships within education, both formally and informally, an anti-capitalist stance, and particularly focus on the absurdities of capitalism, and importantly, an activist conception of humans, which we draw from the work of Brian Fay in particular, and the idea that people create themselves on a basis of their own self-interpretations and are understood to be at least potentially intelligent, curious, reflective, and willful, although we construct ourselves under already given circumstances, of course. And finally, that dialectics is the basic analytic strategy for within critical education. In the next part of the chapter, we try to identify these foundational sources. Of course, Marxism, critical theory in the Frankfurt School tradition, but then also forms of democracy, not the least of which is philosopher John Dewey's radical reconceptualization of democracy as an associated way of living, as a means by which people discover, extend, and manifest human nature and human rights. It follows from that more contemporary works on radical education. We discuss deliberative democracy in the Habermasian terms, agonistic democracy, drawing off Laclau and Mouffe, and the notion of community or pure power, constituent power in democracy. And then finally, is kind of the fourth foundational area, anarchism, the web of theories and practices that operate in opposition to hierarchy and that support and promote mutual aid and respect. So in a way, I guess, I don't know if ALPESH was surprised. I've always kind of flown a red and black flag, and I think in this, this chapter reflects that in particular. In terms of manifestations of critical education, I'll say in air quotes, pedagogical manifestations would absolutely, of course, include Freirean critical pedagogy. Well, I think one of the issues and one of the things that we do in trying to define what critical education is make a distinction between critical pedagogical stances that exist outside of and beyond or inclusive of Freirean approaches, but that critical pedagogy is not the only manifestation of critical education. We engage a couple of critiques, including the classic critique of Ellsworth of critical pedagogy, but also Peter McLaren's own critique of the manifestations of critical pedagogy in real world schooling. Then we go through kind of a set of anarchist manifestations that include the work of Goodwin, Freire's modern school movement, Godwin's perspective on anarchism, and more contemporarily, Abraham de Leon's notion of the subversive potential of anarchist epistemology.
That's just sliding over 5 now. Wait.
And then we talk about dissident institutions, folk schools, free schools, etc. But in the end, our conclusion is this, that the primary question asked by critical education is, why are things the way they are? And we believe that critical education makes possible, what counts as critical education makes possible the rejection of hegemonic social and cultural assumptions, and that provokes action for social change. So in the end, that's the final criterion. So thank you.
Many thanks, Wayne. Excellent. We on my list just have the last presentation, which is, just going to pick my list up there. MARIYA, IVANCHEVA, and Robert OVETZ. And I reckon we've got an easy peasy run up to the top of the hour for the two of you, if you want to use it as your two presenters. I'll just hand over straight to you. Thank you very much.
So thanks, ALPESH, for inviting, and we're missing one of the speakers, who is David Harvey. So what we'll do in the next 5 to 8 minutes is that I will start laying a bit the foundations of how we came together to write about the topic, which is the political economy of the public university. And then I'll kind of mention briefly the theoretical framework that we're using, and then Robert will develop a bit more on one of the case studies that we look into and the implications for trade union organizing. The reason why this last thing is so important is that we came together through the trade union, the USU in University and Colleges Union, David and I, and through like academic organizing, Robert and David way before they met me. But also, and I think, so we had the task, which I think the whole probably collection has stumbled upon and will be stumbling upon critically, which is how to make a volume like this in the English Language Academy without it being Anglo-centric or Anglo-American centric. I don't know how much we have managed. I'm a Bulgarian myself working on Latin America and Southern Africa, but this time it really was my work on and within the UK academia that led me into the conversation with Robert and David and to this chapter. The reason why we chose to focus on the US and UK public university in specific is in a way because first to write the political economy of the public university, let alone of the university nowadays, just would require such a amount of clarifications of which exactly system are we speaking of. Is it the Humboldtian, Napoleonian, Anglo-Saxon, or is it some hybrid that exists in the peripheral contexts? But then the other thing is that I think that what we've kind of come to believe in is that it is important to speak about this university right now because it has become the victim of its own success. Because in the post-war era, this became the institution that turned from the institution of reproduction of social inequalities into a main turf on which a lot of class struggles and also struggles for decolonizing in peripheral regions of the world was fought, and which managed in certain ways, and now we're speaking especially of the English and some of the kind of American systems like the Californian system where Robert is based, public university, to also through certain type of public expenditure to open its door more widely. So it combined a kind of quality plus equality, and in a way it has been emulated in what has become the reason, or the kind of the beginning of its end, which is the rankings, which is the way that this system has become a kind of model to lead the neoliberalization of higher education around the world. So this is the kind of stipulation that we make before we delve into some of the issues. And so some of the issues that we delve in through a kind of autonomist Marxist framework are around especially the moment when we're having a kind of division of labor between research and teaching, and in which social reproduction work, which is teaching and pastoral care especially, is given to a growingly precarious, growingly feminized labor force that is now at the brink of, if not extinction. We've seen that USU has published figures of 80% of academics kind of tending to want to leave academia very soon. But it's also created a kind of extreme stratification, and it has brought class struggle on the turf of the university. And one of the ways that it has also done that is by to kind of buffer it out and not allow it to happen there, is to also outsource a lot of the academic labor. Nowadays, some programs, including my former employment venue, which was the University of Liverpool, have programs with private corporations where 50 to 80% of all the faculty are outsourced faculty. So they're hired by private corporations to supervise and teach on programs that appear as university programs, but are actually owned and taught by these corporations. I'll leave to Robert to develop a bit on algorithmic management and resistance.
Thanks, Mariya. ALPESH, thank you for having us include our chapter in this wonderful book. So very briefly, our chapter also deals with the impact of algorithmic management in higher education, particularly with academic labor, and how understanding how, for example, Zoom and Canvas and other learning management systems carry out what Harry Braverman so masterfully demonstrated, the de-skilling of labor. By rationalizing our skilled labor into its component parts in order to automate, outsource, and de-skill it. I think of these new tools that we were forced out of necessity during the pandemic to start using as Frederick Taylor's digital stopwatch. These tools we carefully analyze as mechanisms for carrying out that rationalization of academic labor. And we conclude the chapter by making a call for academic organizers and labor unions to focus on these new tools as the greatest threat to our profession, and also to develop new tactics and strategies for confronting them. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to stop there. So thank you for having us as part of this book, ALPESH.
Thank you very much, Mariya. Thank you very much, David. ALPESH, I don't know where, there you are. You moved on my screen. It's really now just up to me after these fantastic presentations to once again echo the comments that have been made by all of us, recognizing the contribution, the hard work, the effort, the dynamism that you put into producing this monumental, massive piece of work. And then I'll just hand over to you to wind us down and lead us into the final session.
Yeah, thanks ever so much, folks. That's yeah, just amazing to get to this point. And it's just really good to see so many kind of people together who I know from across the world, and lots of people who I don't know as well. And I've been finishing these book launches just by saying a few things, just a handful of bullet points. The first one is to pay tribute to those people who are undertaking industrial action. It's been an awful long time now. So there's industrial action going on here in the UK. So Mariya is one I know who's been, in and against it. And David Harvey, who can't be here as well. There's been various people, and in Canada, I know there's been industrial action, and in Australia and parts of the States as well. So just to pay tribute to those people. And it's great for everyone to, to be gathered like this. It's just very nice to see people who, have really inspired me, and people who have, who I think are really doing some great work in the field. One person who can't be with us today is Terry Wrigley. So Terry was a dear friend of mine, and he unfortunately passed away last year. And so his chapter has been, well, he'll never get around to seeing his chapter, but it's a very good chapter. So many people have thanked me for, for pulling this book together, but really it's a collective effort. It's an almighty effort on all of our parts. There's 40 entries, 51 authors, 14 countries, 5 continents. It's been a real kind of, it's been a real collective effort on the part of so many people going through so many different things. I see PETAR Jandric here, who's been through an earthquake, people who've been through COVID. In fact, some of the contributors who can't make it today, can't make it because of COVID. And obviously kind of the pressures of neoliberalism in the workplace. And David is one of those people, David Harvey, who couldn't make it. So, just for me to say thank you to everyone who's kind of contributed to this amazing book. And I do think it's an amazing book. There's lots of diversity there. And, that's what PETAR said, diversity makes us stronger, and he's absolutely right. So in the introduction, one of the things that I say in regards to the way that I designed the book and the invitations that I put out to people was around renewing dialogues. And as PETAR also said, it's not about kind of following Marx, it's about continually reinventing Marx and Marxism. And one of the things that I say in the introduction is that I think we need to be doing this in 3 ways, and we are doing it in 3 ways. And this is what the chapters contribute to doing. Reinventing Marx internally. So within ourselves, within the intellectual tradition, talking to each other, finding tensions, finding those points at where, there's perhaps a contradiction and where we can get to some kind of subtlety and sophistication. I think that's really important to do. But also renewing dialogues and reinventing Marx externally as well. So those people, people who are constantly attacking Marxism for not being relevant, for being outmoded and all of those kind of things, for claiming it's too essentialist, all of those things, but renewing dialogues with those people continually to keeping Marx relevant. And also the final way of renewing dialogues is what I call ontologically. I borrow very strongly from Roy Bhaskaar's critical realism, and this is about kind of making sure that Marxism is with reality and it's working with reality to find those points at where neoliberalism is working, capitalism is working, social relations of production are being created, and getting to a point, finding those points, those kind of pressure points where we can keep pushing against them for revolutionary activity to, kind of create a world that we want to see. I wanted the book to feature the richness of the intellectual field of Marxism, and that meant covering the traditional problematics and people, labor power, commodity forms, economy, agency, structure, all of those kind of traditional problematics. I also wanted the chapters or the entries to feature new areas of thinking within Marxism, and that's, the examples here include a chapter by Grant Banfield on critical realism. There's one on disasters by John Preston. There's one on decolonization by Spiros Temelis. There's one on AI. There's several on AI, actually. There's stuff on pedagogy, human rights, law, really kind of pushing Marxism into new areas and renewing dialogues and reinventing Marxism. So in addition to covering the traditional problematics and pushing Marxism into new directions, I also wanted some of those kind of tensions to emerge as well within the intellectual tradition, because it's such a big place. Marxism is a big place and there's lots of tensions, and we can only kind of get to the bottom of those tensions, not necessarily resolve them, but at least have a dialogue to build a stronger Marxism. And those tensions include the place of race, gender, class, disability, China, and some of the things that were mentioned by Sarah earlier on today as well, in relation to different types of discriminations. So it's about dialogue, keeping Marxism invigorated, because if we don't do that, then it'll be buried. It's very, very easy to bury Marxism. And as people who many people here are within faculties and departments in various different places, in education, in sociology, social work, and so forth, we know that we're often operating on the margins. And I wanted the book to also have a raison d'etre to bring us together, because whilst we're on the margins within institutions, together we must be stronger, and that's why I think we must continue these dialogues and keep renewing them. As Bernard said earlier on, Marx didn't write the last word. It's about kind of keeping these things going, and partly keeping these things going in relation to new developments in the field. So many of you will have heard of new materialism and post-humanism, which has taken a very strong grip in departments, in all different departments within British universities. I want us to be kind of having critiques. I personally think new materialism is really poor analytically and theoretically, philosophically. It's very, very poor. And I want us to be having these discussions, pushing us into, these areas where we perhaps don't feel all that comfortable. And, these areas might be critical race theory, technology, and so forth. Executing a project like this, I think, must be personal. I think Marxism is personal. It has to be, otherwise we would let go of it. It's not easy to be Marxist. And the people who I invited are authors who have really inspired me in one way or another. They've interested me with work that they're doing. I've not agreed with all of them or anything like that, but it's about kind of building this this kind of, you know, big book knowledge in different ways, speaking to different people rather than saying, you know, kind of, we're not going to speak to you because we don't like you. This is all about kind of dialectics and historical materialism, as Sarah said earlier on. There's a time and a place to be sectarian, but I don't think that's right now. I think, you know, we need to be talking to each other because there's so many things that are going on and so many complexities in the world. And this is the way that I approach the introduction as well. To, you know, I said all of these things. I was warned against writing it in a personal vein, but I thought you can't really do Marxism without it being personal. You know, the political is personal and the personal is political. And so I wrote it in a very autobiographical way. And I hope other people do that as well, because I think that's what makes these things interesting. I'm really pleased with the way that the book's come out, and, you know, thank you so much to those contributors who are in the room today. I suppose one of the only kind of disappointments is that I couldn't include more people, you know, a more kind of representative sample of authors, for instance. The other disappointment is that the book is simply too expensive. It's prohibitive for most people to purchase outright. But there is a couple of ways of getting the book, and that's by, I would suggest writing a book review, you know, a 700-word book review. All you need to do is get a journal editor or a magazine editor to tentatively agree to run with the with your book review, and you can get, you know, a very expensive book for that. It's well worth having on your shelf. The other thing that I'm looking for is that it's obviously written in English, and one of the contributors today talked about, you know, trying to make Marxism as open as possible in different languages. And what I would like is people to perhaps come forward and either offer themselves or offer others who can translate the book into different languages. You know, there's English is spoken by a minority of people on planet Earth. So, you know, if people in this room know anybody who can translate into Chinese or, you know, or Mandarin or Hindi or, you know, Spanish or Portuguese, please do come forward. And I really want the book to be translated. And there's various ideas I've got to make it manageable. So the very final thing, I've got two more things to say. The very final thing is to say, well, this is the final online book launch. I've tried to accommodate, you know, different audiences, different time zones, but we move into a phase where we're going to, where I'm going to do in person, God, imagine that, doing 3D events. That's incredible, isn't it? And there's going to be one tomorrow evening in Bristol, if anybody's around, at the University of the West of England, where I'm based. And then later on, at the end of April, I'm going to be at AERA, the American Education Research Association annual conference in San Diego. If you're there, please do drop me a line, or if you know the people who are going to be there, drop me a line. And then the final in-person 3D book launch is going to be at the International Conference on Critical Education in Thessaloniki in Greece this year, which is just a brilliant place, a brilliant conference. Obviously, most people can't make these overseas trips. But if you would like to keep in touch with each other, with me, with other events, you know, I'm pretty well connected within kind of Marxism, and I tend to post different events and different books and things like that, different talks on my Facebook group, which is called Marxism and Renewing Dialogues. So it's a closed private group, but, you know, drop me a message and join that group. So the very final thing before I stop recording and we move into a period where we can start to have a plenary is just to say a huge thank you to all the contributors and people who have made it here today for this final online book launch. And thanks to Brill and Bill and Brad, the series editors, and also Vera Fernandez, who's in the room, who helped during the final stages of production, and the indomitable Dennis Beach as well for chairing this meeting in such an officious fashion. So thank you ever so much, folks. Do take care. I'm going to stop the recording so then we can get on to some discussion now. That didn't stop the recording, that stopped my camera. Right, stop.